I'm going to just read from this, so I'm not going to ad-lib, unless you want me to ad-lib. Yeah, move the furniture. Fine. Okay. Okay, I guess I'm going to call this meeting to order. Hello, we have a room full of very enthusiastic people here, and we have, I don't know how many people in the cyber world, but welcome. My name is Ellen Valade. I have the honor to be the chair of the Acton Democratic Town Committee, and Jamie said, why don't we have a forum on affordable housing? And the Acton Democratic Town Committee and the Boxborough Committee and the Littleton Committee and the Maynard Committee all said, what a great idea. So here you are. And the topic tonight, welcome, welcome. The topic tonight is how to create and support affordable housing in your community. And as you must know, it's an enormous topic. It's a topic of huge relevance, increasing relevance in everyone's wheelhouse. It's just become something that we're all aware of, and I think the crowd here tonight will testify that this is not a small, insignificant topic. It deeply resonates with all of the democratic values that we support, which is to help our fellow people have the best life possible. And housing is a crucial element in that. So I hope tonight you will learn, I'm about to introduce these marvelous people, you will learn from this panel of experts. You will gain knowledge, and hopefully it'll increase your commitment to get out there and make more affordable housing a reality for folks. I'm going to introduce Abhi Kurve. Help me, I'm going to read from this so I don't mess it up. From Citizens
Housing and Planning Association, CHAPA.
Thank you, from CHAPA. And Abhi is going to tell us, going to tell us much of importance. And we have here also Kelley Cronin, who's the director of the Acton Housing Authority. Welcome, welcome, welcome. And this gentleman I'll get to in a moment. And then we have Anna Hueston from did I pronounce it right? I always wonder. From Littleton, the town of Littleton, and your hat tonight is the Littleton Planning Board. She was the DTC chair years ago. We did a lot of organizing together. And my new best friend, Maureen Parlon, who's a citizen of Littleton and also one of our important guest speakers this evening. And now I will introduce the person who pulled this all together and is forever fighting for better stuff for everyone. And tonight, his topic is affordable housing. Thank you. No introduction, but I'll make one. Senator Jamie Eldridge.
Great. So thank you so much, Ellen, for all the introductions, and good evening, everyone. And thank you so much for coming. And I know, of course, in this hybrid environment, we have a lot of people participating virtually, and hopefully have some questions after the panelists present. As Ellen noted, this event is co-sponsored by 4 Democratic town committees. I think I would really emphasize is that, this isn't a political gathering. It's an issue that's of interest to so many people around affordable housing, and I would say especially in the suburbs. And the title of the forum, How to Create and Support Affordable Housing in Your Community, in my opinion, is everything from sort of the finances, how to actually make it work to truly build affordable housing, to the political will, to a lot of really amazing groups, many of whom are represented here tonight from the 4 towns that are advocating for affordable housing. And I will say, I think that most of the communities in this area are trying to find ways to build more affordable housing. I know through COVID, there were a lot of towns that created for the first time housing trusts or housing boards. So that's very, very encouraging. But I'd be the first to say, as someone that chaired the Housing Committee for 2 terms in the Senate, is that actually building affordable housing, including all the finances, as I know many of our panelists will highlight, is a real challenge. So sort of how to get there. But I would say, particularly in the suburbs, how do we gather more political support on an issue that often there is not a lot of popular support, or sometimes there's opposition to affordable housing, or even just denser housing. So so thank you so much to Ellen and her introductions. Also just want to thank our super volunteers, including Sam Fieldman with tech, Stella Coe, Sahana Pruitt, and Leela Ramachandran. So thank you so much for all of your help in this really impressive environment where we can have everyone participate. So I know forgive me for not recognizing every municipal official, but I did want to recognize my colleague and close friend, Representative Dan Cena. So Representative Cena, thanks very much for being here. Appreciate it. And so I think then we'll start with presentations, because I think we really want to leave time for questions, which I know that we'll be collecting index cards from people that have questions, and then of course there'll be questions submitted online that I'll be looking at as well, and I'll have some questions too. So thanks again. And our first presenter, as Ellen introduced her, is Abhi Kurve, Policy Associate with CHAPA, Citizens Housing and Planning Association. So Abhi, thanks so much for coming here. We've worked for many years on housing policy, so thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Senator Eldridge, and everyone, Senator Eldridge, for arranging this, and everyone for coming here. I'm so excited to be here. I live in Arlington, but work for CHAPA. So I originally have education in public health and policy, but I started working with CHAPA over 5 to 6 years ago and have been a housing person ever since. And have worked with CHAPA on affordable housing policy over the last 5 years. Just to give a brief introduction about our organization, we are an umbrella organization that has advocated for affordable housing policies by advocating with the legislature as well as the administration, and have a membership base that ranges from tenant advocates to affordable housing developers to almost all sort of housing stakeholders inside the housing ecosystem in Massachusetts. And so our job, I work on the policy team at CHAPA, and our job is what we do is to get all of these perspectives and all of these stakeholders together. We convene them so that we are supporting well-informed policy that is brought on by multiple perspectives and diverse stakeholders to ensure that everybody in Massachusetts has a safe and stable home. With that, one thing we know, although there is a lot of data, we don't need data to tell us that housing prices are crazy. The housing market has been so tight all across Massachusetts, and especially in specific towns that are really struggling to maintain the rents, but also allow more people to come into those towns. People are not able to afford homes or rent places at such prices. And that is caused by a multiple set of factors, but one of major ones being lack of enough affordable housing or lack of housing that is available. And so that is sort of squeezing a lot of people out of the community and not allowing a lot of people into communities while we have a great working economy. And so there is no, as we see it, there is no single magic bullet to address this crisis, housing crisis, but lack of housing. There are a multiple set of solutions that we need to apply in order to really help create more housing, help bring in more families, and make sure that everybody is able to afford a home. And with that, that is something CHAPA has worked on. We are really glad that with the legislature's help, last session, a huge zoning reform passed through the legislature, and which was sort of one of the biggest zoning reforms in over 40 years, which basically made it a little bit easier for homes to be built. It made the permitting process slightly bit easier by bringing down from supermajority to simple majority for certain smart growth housing zoning changes. And so we are really glad that that happened, and that is something we are building on now. As I talked about multiple set of solutions, we are trying to address this issue from the perspective of resources, making sure there are enough resources to help build housing, but also the policies in place. There are policies in place to make sure that the permitting processes are easier, that we have enough of the support from the communities as well to build that housing. I'm going to ask if we have the, yeah. Just to help people get the visual understanding of what all is it that we are trying to do. This one would be CHAPA. And till we get the slides up. So our focus is on, first of all, the people. Our whole work is focused on advancing policies that are for people, especially those with moderate to low incomes, making sure they have homes, and also creating a housing market that works for all, that we have housing for all income levels. Some of the other pillars that we work on are producing more housing. It's important to create homes that we need, that are affordable. Planning for that housing. If we plan for housing now, that is something we are going to see over the next few years. Housing is something that takes time, and so what we do now is going to really impact how things work out in our communities over the next few years. Since we have the slides up, thank you. So CHAPA has a bold plan to cultivate stronger housing ecosystem. Our plan is to create 200,000 homes by the end of the decade, and in that we are trying to make sure that we have 40,000 affordable homes and 20,000 deeply affordable. So that would match with the people who have lesser than 80% AMI or lesser than 30% area median income. And that is something that we are trying to achieve over the next few years, and all our calculations based on what is it the resources that we need for building those many homes in Massachusetts. That is how our plan is sort of set up. Next slide. So this is, as I said, a multi-pronged solution. We work for people. Our policies are informed by the people. We work on creating more homes, for planning for a better future, planning where those homes should go so that communities have a say in how that development is happening in their spaces, in their communities, and making sure that it works for everyone. At the same time, preserving the homes that we do have. There is a lot of aging homes and aging infrastructure, and we need to make sure that those things are cared for, that we don't let that get dilapidated, and make sure it's kept up to date. And so those are the four things. There are a lot of state policies that we work on. The MBTA communities and the housing choice reform passed was sort of a big example of how state policy can really help drive things on the local level and provide tools for communities to build the housing that they need and that they can plan for. And this session, as the legislative session starts in this year and goes on for 2 years, we are advocating for multiple bills that would help not just create housing, but plan for it, make zoning a little bit easier, and way that it makes sense. So I'm not going to go through the whole list because that would put everybody to sleep. But I'm going to just highlight a few things here. So we have the zoning reforms to allow for more homes bill. And I'm going to go through each of them in the next few slides. So if you can go further. So I'm happy to share this presentation with everyone as well. This can be made public so you get to know. But we also thank Senator Eldridge, who has been a sponsor for some of those legislations. Establishing an Office of Fair Housing. We have great fair housing laws, but we need to make sure they're enforced. And so having a statewide Office of Fair Housing can ensure that any level of discrimination is sort of attended to. Next slide. production, so this is something I want to spend some time on. There is a lot that can be done on producing. How do we produce new housing? That requires bringing together resources as well as policy, and that is where one of our major priorities is going to be a housing bond bill. Without getting too much into weeds, it's basically the bill that provides capital funding for subsidizing housing development. So any affordable home that gets, any affordable units that get built in a development need government subsidies, which sort of come from the housing bond bill, is the easiest way of putting it. And we are glad that Senator Eldridge has helped champion for housing bond bills in the past, and we definitely look for his support in the future. But that is a major investment in housing and making sure that we have the resources we need. But along with that, rental assistance for people who are just trying to get by but are falling short of rent, making sure they have either housing vouchers or short-term rental assistance to just sort of get some help on making the rents and making sure that's established in the state statute. And we are expanding on the programs that we know work and provide housing assistance. Next slide. Next slide. So planning, this is a major one for many communities. Promoting, yes, in my backyard. We know that a lot of us want to see housing, but when it comes to a new development, there is a lot of opposition in many communities, and we understand that sometimes there is a legit reason for that opposition, but sometimes we do also have to understand and balance balance it out between the needs and the risks, and that is where having such bills which would make it a little bit easier for smart growth zoning policies to pass. One of the things in the bill is having ADUs by right. That is something that is happening across many other places in the country, and there is any sort of way that we can introduce a number of housing or create more homes in the existing structures can be really good for many number of households, and that is something that we are trying to push for through those bills. There is also the same bill also has provisions for using underutilized state land. It's for utilizing commercial properties like malls and other things for building housing. And so as and when we make these processes easier and tie them up with the right funding, we can really see communities get more vibrant, have a better tax base, and also use the land in a way that works for them, for more people, and make communities more thriving and help businesses thrive as well. When we have more people living there, it's easier for that business to thrive as well. So that is just something. We are also glad to see Senator Eldridge sponsor the Climate Adaptation Infrastructure and Affordable Housing Investment, which is basically a bill that would create some sustainable revenue for projects that would help with affordable housing. And so that is something we are also pushing for. Next slide. And preservation, making sure any of our public housing buildings that are preserved, that we are making investments in the capital improvements of those buildings. There are so many of them that are really old, and we need to make sure that they are looked after. And so we are really glad that many of the legislations to help do that, to redevelop public housing have gone ahead. But this is ensuring continued right for public housing tenants. We have seen that many residents, when redevelopments happen, the ownership changes, and so tenants can lose their rights, which they would have under public housing. So ensuring that the rights of public housing tenants are maintained is something that we are trying to push for through these bills. And even acting on zero carbon renovation fund, making sure we have resources if we do want to get more energy efficient in our housing around schools, public housing, and many other buildings that can really use funding for upgrading their energy infrastructure is something that we are looking at. And so this is just sort of an overview of all the things we are trying to do. There is so much more that we are trying to do, but this is just sort of a snapshot into the bills that we are trying to promote on the state level, which would eventually really help the communities on the local level to use these as tools. It's not something that we want to impose, but these are tools that communities can use to design the community the way they see it into the future. Next slide. And with that, I know the state policies and state level politics can sometimes feel too far, but it's not really. All of the legislators are extremely approachable, as we know, and it's really it's just about keeping yourself informed, getting involved. We at CHAPA, as I said, convene a lot of committees that are focused on public housing, rental assistance, affordable housing production and preservation. And so just getting involved in more organizations like this that help you stay informed about what's going on, what are the timelines, when are the public hearings, when can you go and voice your support on the state level for certain policies that make sense to you, can be really helpful. We have a lot of committees focused on budget advocacy as well, to make sure that we are fighting for increased funding in these programs, which eventually comes down to communities and are able to help residents who are struggling to make rent. So it feels far-fetched, but it's something that really impacts many in our communities. And so being involved can really lend your voice and make sure ensure that you're involved in the state policy processes as well. Talking to your legislators and elected officials about what you want to see happen in your community, especially when it comes to getting something done on housing. We do hear a lot when people don't want to see certain kind of housing, but sometimes it's really helpful to have people talk about what they do want to see and what are the developments they do support. And so even if you feel there are other people supporting, it's always helpful to show up to the local meetings or local forums and express your support, and especially in the town meetings, expressing your support for housing in the town meetings can really sometimes change the conversation, and that is something we at CHAPA and some of our other teams at CHAPA are working for, like our municipal engagement team. Some of you have been probably involved with that. They help build local coalitions, not go into the community and say this is what you need to do, but sort of elevate the voices in that community to go up and speak for pro-housing, or even sort of start the conversations on what is needed, where can we see this development, which area in our community do we want to see more development, and just have those conversations and take them to your elected officials to sort of take it forward. And advocate for affordable housing and thriving communities. There are lots of chances. I'm happy to share more links on how you can get involved with CHAPA and the work that we do on the state level, but also on the local level. And so we are thankful for many of you people working with us on the municipal engagement, especially the Acton Housing for All group, who CHAPA worked with through the Municipal Engagement Initiative, and they helped in removing certain barriers to ADUs, disposition of town-owned land. I know Acton Housing Authority was involved in that, and so we are really happy to sort of push those things forward and elevate those examples to make sure communities are working together and sort of exchanging what works for them, and eventually getting to a place where we are creating housing not just for today's need, but what is going to be the need for the future generations, even for people 5 years, 10 years down the line, and how we want to see our communities to be. So with that, I'm happy to end my presentation and pass it on to Kelley.
Great, thank you so much, Abhi. Really appreciate your presentation. You do a lot of these, and the thing I would say about CHAPA, just to imagine, sort of I see the impact of CHAPA is, it's sort of a gathering place for all of those entities that quite honestly build housing and affordable housing. And I always think of the annual CHAPA awards dinner at the South Boston Convention Center, where you literally have, I think, 2,000 people. I might be
at times like 1,400 to 1,500.
Yeah. And just all these different entities, again, different perspectives on housing, but really bringing people together with an agenda. So thank you so much. So thanks for your presentation. And actually now we're going to go to Maureen Parlon, another longtime friend of mine that lives in Littleton. And Maureen, you and I talked earlier about if you can just share your experience, your interaction on housing, including affordable housing, and whatever you wish to share. But thanks so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me. I've been in housing in Littleton about 5 years now. It's been a roller coaster. It's been up and down. It's been a challenge. It's not easy. I live alone. I have a 2-bedroom. I've had to fight for everything I wanted. They do make you jump through hoops and for everything you need. You literally have to get a doctor's note for every little thing you might need changed in your apartment. Littleton Housing Authority is pretty easy to deal with, I will say that. They have been decent to me. I don't typically have to deal with them. I do my paperwork with them and that's it. It's who you rent from, and people don't realize that. You have your housing authorities, you do your paperwork with them. That's the end of it. You're done with them for a year. It's who you rent from. That's who you have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And that can be really difficult. And that can be that's your landlord, honestly, because your housing authority will tell you we're not your landlord. So and people don't understand that. And housing authorities don't tell you that until you're knee deep into it, and they don't explain that to you until you're knee deep into it, and you're arguing with your office manager about whatever the situation may be. So it's a challenge, and people need to understand that you have to fight for yourself. I'm on disability, and I do. I fight for myself. I am a huge advocate, and I will fight for my friends. I will fight for my brother. And I have reached out to the senator when I've gotten myself so frustrated that I didn't know where to turn, and I'm like, Jamie, please. And he's always been there. But I literally had to have 4 doctors write a letter for me to get a washer and dryer in my unit. And that's ridiculous. And these are the things we have to fight for. And it's not necessary. And why should we have to? If you're on disability and you can't walk from one building to another because it's clear across the parking lot to do laundry, why should you have to get 4 doctors to say you're disabled? And these are the things we have to fight for. And I don't know if our housing authorities realize that we as tenants have to fight so hard for this. And these are questions that a lot of us have is, do our housing authorities realize what we have to go through to fight for ourselves? And what, we literally have to go through. It's just, it's not fair. Our children that play down there, our grandchildren that play at our homes have nothing to do because they don't want to do ADA compliant playgrounds for our kids to play at because it's too much work for them. It's too much for them to do. I had my office manager tell me, nope, we're not putting in a swing set because we don't want to make it ADA compliant. She said that to me. I'm a grandmother of an autistic child. That hit me right here. So, things like that. It's not fair. It's not fair. We should have a playground, a swing set, a splash park, something for our kids to do that we don't have to leave our residence. There's nothing for them to do. I live at Pondside in Littleton. It's not fair. I mean, we can't put pools up. We can't In the summertime, they can't have little kiddie pools. Can't have any of that. Thank
So Maureen, thank you so much. And I just want to clarify, you have a voucher and where you live is private housing, right? But you have a voucher, right?
I do have a voucher.
Yeah.
I do have a voucher. And I will say that the gentleman who oversees that particular facility, I don't know how many properties he oversees. He did go above and beyond. I will give him credit. During COVID. To help me secure that voucher in an emergency. I had a situation happen that I was living with my daughter, and she decided that she didn't want to reside together anymore, and she packed up and moved out. And we were in a 3-bedroom, and she just packed up and left. So I was stuck, and I needed emergency help right away. And so Ryan, literally, I don't know how we did it. To this day, I don't know how it went down. All I know is it was fast, and he secured me a voucher that I was able to stay. And I'm lucky, and I'm blessed, and I'm happy there. I do my thing. I have my own place. I'm in a nice unit. I have what I need. I'm comfortable where I am, and I just, I'm okay now. I'm okay now. Now that I'm okay.
So Maureen, thank you so much it's very personal to share your story, so thank you so much for sharing your story. We'll have questions.
But I appreciate everybody who, it was a struggle, but, and I appreciate everybody who was there to help me, the senator, and his staff and his office, and, it's tough.
I'll have plenty of questions for you later, so thank you.
I'll be here.
Thank you again. So thank you, Maureen. And now we're going to have Anna Hueston, member of the Littleton Planning Board, talk about her work in Littleton. So Anna, thanks for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jamie. And welcome to everyone here in the audience and for folks watching at home as well. So I'm going to share some information about Littleton. So if we can cue up the slide with the Littleton housing numbers. So Littleton has a total of 3,889 housing units. I think it's the next slide, please. Thank you. And of those, 458 are affordable units, are also on our subsidized housing inventory called the SHI, which includes both rentals and ownership. So as you can see from the math, that's more than 10% of our housing is affordable in Littleton, but that's not enough. And so we had some research done last year and learned from the CHAMP, the Common Housing Application for Massachusetts Programs, that we have 58 families from Littleton who applied and another 40 seniors and or disabled individuals who applied as well. So that means that we have a large unmet need in Littleton, and we'd like to be able to do something about it. So for the future, we have some planned developments. Actually, I'm sorry, if you can go back. That's okay. So for the future, we do have some planned developments. And for folks who know about the new MBTA communities law, Littleton is trying to comply with that law as well as creating more affordable. And so we have 3 different developments, if I can explain those real quick. You all probably know, if you are familiar with Littleton, that along 495, there's a building that had a big IBM logo on it. Well, they are now gone, and so the first development is there on that site. It's called King Street Common, and it is planned to have up to 780 units. Then across the street from there, in the building called The Mill, we the planning board has approved up to 285 units. And then the third piece is at the train station, which is still in discussions. There could potentially be another 150 units. So all told, that is what we're looking at, in addition to a couple of other really small ones with 1 or 2 units here and there. So that means that over the next few to 10 years, we will be seeing all of these 1,000+ units in Littleton. And what that means is that we will have 40 units specifically for seniors, for low income, 30 to 60% AMI. We will have 73 affordable units at less than 80% AMI, and for Littleton, that's less than 67,000 for a one-person household. And then for moderate income households, and this is a big gap in Littleton where we don't have very much moderately affordable housing, 630 units between 80 and 120% AMI. So that's what we have planned. And now if we can go to the next slide. As Jamie mentioned earlier, political will is huge to make some of this happen. But also, I think the town needs to be prepared. I think having some foundational documents available, for example, a master plan. In 2017, Littleton was able to accept its master plan that was created, and there is a chapter in there about housing, and we have 5 specific housing goals that we are working toward and making good progress. And we also have our 2014 housing production plan, and we plan to update that this year. So those are pretty key for any city or town to have. But in addition to that, over the last 5 or 6 years, Littleton has been adopting very conducive bylaws. Here are 6 of them that exemplify what we have done to be able to allow for affordable housing to flourish. For example, we do have an affordable housing trust right now. It is funded with CPC funds as well as other dollars such as fee in lieu from developers when they choose to opt out of building a unit, and they donate money instead. And our trust is almost up to $1 million. And so the inclusionary housing bylaw that went into effect also in 2017 is a requirement that any development have 10% affordable units in the development. And as you can see, there's also some bylaws that we enacted to be able to create very specific senior residential developments. So bylaws are just a start, and there are additional requirements to really create affordable housing. Again, I'm going to beat this drum. It takes political will, and from the town leadership, that means that they need to be able to execute on any plans that might be available, and they also need to be open and willing to hear opportunity when it's knocking at the door. In terms of residents, I do believe that it is important for residents to understand the demographics in their town and what is needed. I mean, we all probably know of a neighbor or a friend down the street who could probably use some affordable housing. So understanding those demographics townwide is important. And then the planning. As Abhi mentioned, being able to get onto your local boards, whether it's the Housing Authority or Affordable Housing Trust if you have one, or even the Planning Board. It's fun. And then when it comes to town meeting, gathering all of your network and showing up and voting yes. Okay. In terms of the strategy, That's really critical. The town needs to know what it wants, and it needs to know where it wants it and when it wants it. And that's one of the beauties of being able to have a master plan. I know in Littleton, we said we want development near the point, or at the point, I should say, where Market Basket is located. We want it in the common, and we want it at the train station. That's where we want it, so we know where we don't want it. We don't want to give up any of our green space. We don't want to give up any of our farms. We want it where we want it. And as a planning board member, I fight really hard to make sure that that happens. We also have information in there about, the time span, which is, over time. I know the numbers I presented are big numbers for a small town, but that's not going to happen tomorrow. It's going to take years. It could take up to 10 years before we see all of these numbers. And then the towns need to be able to have land either available that could be donated for affordable housing or acquired. Maybe you have a CPC in your town that would be able to build up enough money to contribute toward affordable housing, or a building, if a building can be acquired or repurposed. I think Jamie said at the beginning that money can be, or maybe it was Abhi who said that money can be elusive, because it is very challenging, but it's out there, and it's a matter of figuring out how to go about it. And it could very well be different buckets. It could be private money, it could be public money, it could be a public-private partnership, all of the above, and each scenario is going to be different. And finally, what I would call another very important factor for creating affordable housing is the developer partnership. It needs to be a partnership. The relationship is really critical. So if a city or a town is planning and you have a particular site in mind or building, and if the town can find a nonprofit organization to work with that has done this before, they can really help guide the entire process, and that's so critical. And then as far as the developer goes, finding somebody who has a track record of actually building this. Don't be somebody's guinea pig. Have they actually been able to create a development with affordable housing in it as a component? I know that from my time on the planning board that sometimes having developers coming in and asking for the affordable housing component is like pulling teeth, and that's just not okay. So having these bylaws behind us is really critical. And in other situations, we've had developers come in and they fully acknowledge what needs to be done for that affordable component, and they'll even add some more. So that relationship really is important to try to have a partnership. And so in closing, I'll just say that whether it's a planned development or the town is responding to an opportunity that's knocking on the door, I hope that this is helpful. Another helpful tool that I found online recently is something called housingtoolbox.org. It's a website created by Mass Housing Partnership that really talks through a lot of what I've said in a lot more detail. And then also, I would like to highlight CHAPA's assistance. When I was first wanting to advocate more for affordable housing in Littleton, Jamie put me in touch with Dana at CHAPA, and I have since been able to create a presentation that I've shared town-wide, and CHAPA, Lily and Dana at CHAPA took a look at it for me, and they helped me to understand what area median income is, and they helped me to understand how to best convey it to the community. And so I'm very grateful to CHAPA for that. And so that's where we are in Littleton. Thank you, and happy to take any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Anna. And there's just really not many planning board members that are really advocating for affordable housing like you have done, so really appreciate your leadership on that. And now we're going to hear from Kelley Cronin, Executive Director of the Acton Housing Authority, and I'll just say that obviously I'm biased being from Acton, but Acton really the Housing Authority has really stepped up to build new public housing and affordable housing, and I just think that's such an important point looking out on people who are from multiple communities is more often than not, local housing authorities in this region, most of my district, are really not looking at building new public housing or new affordable housing. And I do think that's an important conversation to have with your housing authority if there is one in your community. So, but Kelley, thank you.
Sure. Hello, everybody. I was asked to talk about developing housing, but not to talk about public housing. But if people have any questions about public housing, I'm more than happy to answer them. To get back to the CHAPA issue, I'm part of my professional organization, which is MassNARO, which is a statewide advocacy group for public housing authorities. And we are working with CHAPA and Mass Union of Public Housing Tenants and Greater Boston Interfaith Organization to get more resources for public housing. We're asking for twice as much money in the operating budget because there's not enough money to do the maintenance that we need to do in our units. And we're asking for more bond money because there's not enough money in our developments to do the capital projects that we need. There was a $600 million bond bill a few years ago for public housing, but the need, according to the state, to replace all the expired components is $3.2 billion. So we're asking that the state hopefully will be able to give us some more money. We met with the director of DHCD, Jennifer Maddox, to ask if the governor and the lieutenant governor, since it's a new administration, can help push some of these items. The lieutenant governor was on the board of the Salem Housing Authority, so we're hoping we have a friend there, but the four organizations are working collaboratively together to try to push this agenda, and we're very lucky in our communities that we have Rep. Sina and Senator Eldridge, who've always been our friends and always advocated for our resources. But I just want to let people know that there's all these organizations trying to help get the resources needed for the existing housing, not just for new housing, because we have to make sure we have enough money for the existing housing as well. So in Acton, the Housing Authority Board really tried to look at over 10 years ago, what kinds of housing do we need to build? So over 10 years ago, we did create some new family housing over at Whittlesey Village, which is on Sachem Way, and it was the only place we could find, our own land was the only place we could find that we could afford to develop. And now we're trying to develop some new units. We just got funding from the state, and we've gotten a lot of local resources from the town as well, to build 41 new units for elder disabled on Main Street. So that's what the senator asked me to talk about. So just real quickly, I wanted to give people just a sense of how communities, how we've done it in Acton, and if other communities are looking at ways to do it. We've been really lucky because there's lots of people in Acton who care about affordable housing. We have the Acton Community Housing Corporation in addition to our board, the Housing Authority Board. CHAPA helped create Housing for All in Acton as well, which is an advocacy organization, but also just people on other boards and committees in town have always cared about affordable housing and have helped us. So one of the things that we did was kind of assess the need. What is the need? Assess the need, try to figure it out. And the organizations in town who help produce the documents that you need to look at are the Community Preservation Committee. They produce a plan for how they're going to spend their dollars, and housing is a required use of that money. So it's important to be at those meetings when the town's putting together their plan to advocate for whatever you think in your town needs to happen for housing, but also working with the town to create a production plan. And the way that those happen and assessing the need is using data from the census. That's a good place to go and find out. So in Acton, we knew we had a lot of people on our waiting list for family housing, but also we were seeing this big change in how long people had to wait for elderly housing and disabled housing in Acton. When I first started, we used to be able to tell people it would take about a year or two to get housing if you were a senior in Acton. Now the wait is over 5 years. And our housing isn't accessible for, so our senior housing, we have seniors housing on second and third floors with no elevators. So we really felt that, and people are aging in place more now than they used to. People are staying in their units. So the board prioritized that, and that's one of the reasons why we're doing elder disabled housing now. So look in your town at the census numbers. You'll see the incomes of your population and then what the market costs are for housing in your community and how much rental housing there is and how much the rental market is costing. And you'll be able to identify where your gaps are for the folks on your list. So in Acton, we have 1,401 seniors on our waiting list. Now, those are not all local applicants. We have about 80 local applicants, but the state created a centralized waiting list. So we went from a 500-person waiting list, household list, to over, what is it now, 9,000? It's 18,000. We have 18,310 people on our waiting list now. And our units are only turning over, we've had a lot of turnover this year, but generally only, it takes 5 years. The 5-year turnover rate for senior units is 4 units a year. So we're just not going to be able to help people anytime soon. It'll take 350 years to serve the current waiting list of local applicants. If you keep going, that's our waiting list now on CHAMP. So we have over 17,000 overall. We have 8,490 families. We have 1,400 elderly and 1,560 disabled applicants. And then for AHVP, and that's an alternate housing voucher, which is for people with disabilities, but a lot of people think that's just the MRVP program, which is for anyone. So that waiting list is almost 9,000, but that's because a lot of people on that waiting list think they're applying for family housing. So as you can see, the need is great in Massachusetts and in our local communities where the rents are, between $2,000 and $3,000 in the market. We need more affordable housing. So then what we did was determine what type of housing type we want and location. So as an organization, you need to look at who's on your waiting list, who's in the community, and where there are possible sites to develop. And we were lucky in Acton that the community was looking at the Main Street site that the town owned. And so that's so we applied. We hired a consultant to help us do a feasibility analysis, because that's an important part of the process too. Before you put together a development proposal, you need to look at, how big is the site, how many units can you get on it, and then what the cost would be to build it, and also what the community would support. Because the community's not going to support hundreds of units on the Main Street site. So that's part of the process that you have to look at as well. So we were lucky because the Community Preservation Committee provided us with pre-development funds, and that way we could hire an architect and an engineer and a development consultant to help us figure out, given the site, given the size of it, how many units can you fit, engineering, civil engineering issues, architectural issues, and then the funding issues. So we hired somebody to do that so we could respond to the town's requests for information when they were putting the property out. And we were very lucky, partly because of the Housing for All group that CHAPA helped form. There was tons of support from the community for this type of housing. So when there were 2 for-profit developers who also applied, and I think 70-something people spoke, and only 2 didn't speak in favor of our proposal, which is really amazing. I mean, it tells you a lot about the Acton community. I mean, that's really amazing. And then when it went to town meeting, 91% of town meeting voted for it. So look at, you have to put together a budget that's the soft costs. When you're doing development in the state of Massachusetts, there's a lot of requirements for what you pay architects and engineers. The private sector would not pay as much money as the public sector has to spend. for architects and engineers and legal, there's ends up being like 5 lawyers because every agency has their own lawyer, and it's very expensive. So even though it's called affordable housing, it's not affordable to build in Massachusetts. It's very expensive to build in Massachusetts. We're lucky the state has been so good and used a lot of their ARPA money, both for public housing and for new construction, for developing new housing. But because the land costs are so high in Massachusetts, it just makes it so expensive. So I actually have a sheet, if anybody wants it, on the desk, which kind of identifies some of the websites that you can go to that help you think through this stuff. Like Mass Housing Partnership has a great housing toolbox, it's called, and it just gives a technical assistance and, what people need to think about when they're thinking about housing. And DHCD also has a site which talks about the different funding programs that they have and what populations they will serve with those funds.
Excuse me, Kelly, but this number, these
Yeah, the funding
stats,
commitments, yeah.
which projects are those?
That project, that's one
Yep.
project, that's
Right.
McManus Manor. So that isn't even the cost of McManus Manor. So let me just give you some. So sources, so the Housing Authority is contributing $100,000 in cash. The CPA's provided $1 million, both for the pre-development and development costs. Acton Community Housing Corporation has committed $275,000. And then we applied to the state in those tax credits. The 950 and the 700 will leverage about, I'm not going to get the number right, I think it's like 12 million in, about 10 million in tax credit investment. So equity partners will invest in the housing to help build it, and it's just a way that the state and feds finance housing. And then we also are providing 75 out of our developer fee. The ARPA provided 250,000, the town voted for that. MassWorks is building a new sewer line, and some of the money for the sewer hookup and some of the site work will be paid for. DHCD gave us $2 million out of ARPA. The Facilities Consolidation Fund, $1 million, because some of our units are being set aside for people with disabilities. DHCD HIF, Housing Innovations Fund, 2,169, and then the Housing HSF Fund, Stabilization Fund's $2 million, and then we'll get a loan for at least $4 million. So for Whittlesey Village, which is family housing, that budget was $4 million 10 years ago, and the town provided $700,000 in CPA, and we got a couple million in DHCD funds, and then we got a loan for over $1 million.
And how many units is that, and for whom is it?
This is 41
And what's the
units.
AMI?
41 units. So we have 7 MRVP vouchers, so those will go to people under 30% of median, 8 Section 8 vouchers, which will go to people under 30% median, and then we'll have under 50% the rest. I believe that's how it works.
Okay, so truly
yeah.
low-income people.
Yeah.
Yep.
So those units hopefully will be breaking ground by the fall. So I also provided a schedule if people want to look at it. It just kind of explains how long it takes from beginning, from conception, thinking about it, going through the community process. It's really important to work with the community. We had 1 million design meetings with the community. We had a local committee hire the architects with us. We invited people from the ACHC. We had an architect. We had a tenant, a neighbor, a business leader, and our local architect all helped do all the interviews for the architects and hire. But it's a long community process because people have, strong opinions about how they want things to look. And also people want to make sure that the units themselves were accessible. There was a large community of folks who wanted us to build housing for people with disabilities, a very active community in Acton, advocating for that. So that's it in a nutshell. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Kelly. So really want to thank all the panelists, and we already have a bunch of questions that Ellen's been collecting from people here in index cards, and I also looking at questions online. So I'll ask a general one for, anyone to take, everyone doesn't have to answer whatever you'd wish, but, talking about the sort of political will and sometimes opposition to affordable housing or denser housing in communities. So the question is, what are effective ways to respond to objections when new housing or affordable housing is proposed?
I can take that.
Sure.
What we have
If you want to press your, sorry.
What we have generally seen is that it makes more sense to elevate the positive voices than to try and win over that battle with people who don't want the housing, because there will be a certain amount of people who just don't want to see anything. There might be a certain amount of people who are still willing to work with you, and you can reason out with them and sort of figure out what are their concerns and address that, and that is what we are hoping to get the developers to do as well, like listen to what the community has to say and try and accommodate their needs. Then they might be better willing to see that kind of development. But then if there are people who just don't want to see anything, who just don't want to see change in their communities, I think the only thing is that if you don't be a part of this process, the community is going to change anyways. This way you can have a voice in how it is going to look over the next few years. So it's better to work with us. But also that's why we have the Municipal Engagement Initiative to just focus on the positive and work with people who are wanting to work with developers and development, and just elevating their voices, giving them tools, giving them data, and giving them more information to sort of get more people to the conversation. Sometimes that also includes making it easier in these forums to have people who don't usually come to these forums, which can be families who do need that housing, but simply are not able to give their evening times, and sort of, reach out to people who you otherwise would not reach out to, have sort of unusual suspects. Sometimes it can be churches, it can be other organizations in the city who actually do see the need, and just getting them to the table to speak up is what we have seen is what works.
Great, thank you so much. There's a question from online, and it perhaps could be for Kelley and Maureen, but how does the voucher system work? And obviously there's different voucher systems, but if you could talk about Section 8, MRVP, HVP, and then what does the applicant do to advocate for getting a voucher?
Do you want me to start? Or do you want
Yeah. Yep.
So the Acton Housing Authority has Section 8 vouchers and alternate housing vouchers, and both of them were part of a centralized waiting list. We don't have our own waiting list. We do give priority and preference to local applicants, so people who live or work in Acton or Boxborough. But that takes a long time too. I'd like to tell people, you're going to get a voucher right away, but really for any type of housing, affordable housing, public housing, the priorities are given to people who are homeless or at risk of homelessness. So people who have, some kind of public event like urban planning removal or condemnation, or a fire or flood, people who are victims of domestic violence, people who for medical reasons can't live in their unit anymore. But unfortunately, I'd love to tell people the waiting list isn't long, but it is long.
Yeah.
And then once you get a voucher from the Housing Authority or the private nonprofit like SMOC and Community Teamworks, those types of organizations, you get the voucher, the Housing Authority briefs you on what the rules and regulations are about, what the rent can be for whatever community you're looking and what the utility allowance is. But then the person who has the voucher goes and finds the apartment on their own. And they negotiate, they go out and they just see which units they want to rent. And then once they've selected a unit and submitted the paperwork from the landlord, it gets inspected to make sure it meets housing quality standards. But the lease and everything is with the landlord, not with the Housing Authority. And the Housing Authority pays the difference between what is a third of the tenant's income for rent and what the rent is. So if a person's rent's 300, if a person's percentage of their income is 300 and the rent is 2,000, the tenant pays the 3,000, the housing authority pays the 1,700 to the landlord.
Thank you, Kelley. Maureen, do you want to talk about your experiences?
So just this year, just this January, our rent changed from 40% of our income to 30% of our income, which was huge. My rent dropped like $113 a month. That's huge. Us girls were like, oh my God. I mean, an extra $100 a month. But yeah, that's all well and good for like a month or two until food stamps catches up with you. And, you know, you have to submit all that. You have to submit that to food stamps. You have to submit that. And then everything balances back out again. So you're really not gaining anything. You know, you get your Social Security, you know, your Social Security goes up. You know, everything balances out. People don't realize that. They say, oh, you got a huge raise in Social Security. Mm-hmm. But I lose it over here. You know, you gain it here, you lose it here. So, you know, you have to learn how to budget. You've got to. And, you know, it's just something you have to do. And, but that 30%, from 40% to 30% was huge this year. And our housing authority was on it, and they were great about it. And they walked us through the whole process of getting our paperwork in. And they, Lisa, and it's actually Mandy this year, she made it very simple for me anyways. And I thank her for that. She was great. And I hadn't worked in 5 years, and I just recently went back to work part-time. It's a struggle, but I did it. And I thank Market Basket for allowing me to go back after 5 years and not being there. I walked back in and I had my job like I never left. Like I never left. So, you know, and I have one of my customers sitting in the audience, and so, you know, it's nice, you know, to be there, and everybody, you know, they walk by and they're like, oh my God, you're back. Oh my God, you're back. You know, it's nice, you know, but that's my hometown. You know, I born and raised there. I've been there all my life, you know, so.
So I think somewhat related, thank you, Maureen, is, and this question is directed at Abhi, though I think each panelist could answer this next question is, so CHAPA's directive is to provide a stable home at all income levels. How can someone dependent on disability keep their housing? And I guess I would broaden that, you know, for perhaps all the panelists is, what steps are being taken to make sure that, you know, there's housing being built for people with disabilities in every community?
We do see the need of housing that is adaptable, accessible, is also in extreme short supply, and that again goes back to production. We do have a bill where we are proposing to not just expand AHVP program, but create project basing of AHVP vouchers, which basically would mean there would be subsidies to, or more subsidies to build affordable units that also are accessible and adaptable. And so which would come with a voucher, which would come with an attached, just like in the state MRVP, there are project-based vouchers. We are hoping to get that forward for AHVP as well. So that would address not just building more accessible and adaptable housing, but also having that income to make sure that whoever is the resident is sort of helped with the voucher as well. So that is just one drop in the bucket, but we do realize we need to see more. There are other policies we are fighting for. Just a connection back to the same point Maureen made about lowering of the tenant rent share from 40% to 30%. That is something that we advocated for, and thanks to the Senate, who took the leadership on that. And that happened in last year's budget, and that is exactly what I was saying, where the state policy can impact everybody's lives, and just it seems like a very small policy and a very nitty-gritty thing, but having these bills actually go forward can make a huge impact when they do. And so the AHVP codification bill, but also expanding the AHVP program by getting more vouchers out, that is something we are also pushing for through the budget and the legislation.
Great, thank you. Others want to weigh in on that? Oh, sure, yep.
I think one thing that would be a huge help for those of us that have vouchers, and this might be something, I don't know, if CHAPA would work on or the senator, would be that those of us that are on disability or are in housing or we go back to work part-time, is not penalize us like in having to report our, because we have to report our to housing what we're working. So that possibly could make my rent go up.
Yeah.
You know, so I'm not really gaining anything, you know, so am I going to be working for nothing? If I am, well, what's the point of me going back to work? You know what I'm saying? I'm not gonna kill myself if I'm, you know, I'm just not gonna.
Yeah.
So, you know, so I mean, I think that's something that a lot of moms say, well, why should I go back to work if they're just gonna take it away? And I think that's something that, you know, is a huge question.
It is, and that is something we refer to as cliff effects, where you sort of are going up, you're making a little bit more income, and then suddenly you are ineligible for one of the programs which gets you back down. So it's like falling down a cliff. We see that in many people we hear that is an issue. The way we see the solution is to expand the eligibility a little bit. For example, even for MRVP vouchers, the AMI was at 50% a couple of years ago, which we pushed to 80%. And that sort of covered people up until they make enough income that they can survive by themselves without their rent or their voucher being taken away. And that is exactly where we are hoping to fight for these policies, expand these programs, get more money in them so that we are able to increase eligibility and sort of cover and not let people just fall off the cliff and move, like balance out those parts, as you're saying.
Nice.
Great, thank you both. Now I have a question for Anna. So Littleton focused. In reference to the Affordable Housing Trust in Littleton, how does it help achieve additional housing if a developer can contribute to a trust in lieu of building housing or affordable housing?
Sure. So the Littleton Affordable Housing Trust does actually have contributions to vouchers for local residents, and so that's one of the ways that it currently uses its funding. And then the big question is, so we have smaller projects in mind. Excuse me. We have the ability to be able to have, I'll give you an example that is still in process. We have the ability to acquire, for the town to acquire a property that will be donated to the town and then be able to rehab that particular property. So in effect, the Affordable Housing Trust could then use some of that money to be able to help rehab the home, to bring it back into a position that it could actually be lived in. And so that would be how those dollars get repurposed through the Affordable Housing Trust. There are a couple of different projects that we have in queue right now, and so those are all at the very early stages.
Great. Thank you so much. So a question that I know has come up a lot in Acton is the discussion around new construction versus rehabbing current housing to make it affordable. So the question is, for tonight, there's been a focus on new building when rehabilitation and preservation is less than half the cost. Again, I'm just reading the question, and thus faster and serves people and is easier on the environment and easier to pass. How come there hasn't been a prioritization on rehabilitation of current housing stock versus new housing? Kelley, you want to take that?
So in Acton, we've done both. We have purchased existing condominiums and converted them into affordable housing. But primarily the reason is because of the funding mechanisms. The state wants to add to the supply of housing. They want to add units, not just add affordable units, but actually add more units. And that's where they've prioritized their funding. I don't think they'll give you money to renovate large amounts of units and convert it to affordable, but not like one unit here or one unit there. So that's primarily the reason. The affordability crisis is here because there isn't enough supply and there's so much demand, and that's why the state funds new.
Thank you. And a follow-up for me, because I always have this question, is, looking at what are the costs to rehab, an old mill building or old school building, as we've done in Acton, versus new housing? Like, is it sometimes more expensive to rehab an old building, or?
That's a case-by-case basis.
Yeah,
It just depends on what kind of, whether there's asbestos, lead paint, those types of things, because that obviously adds to the cost. For old buildings, often it's hard to make them accessible without elevators, and those cost a lot of money as well. And condo fees are insane right now in Acton. Condo fees are like $500 a unit. So you have to be able to pay the condo fee and keep the rent at a level that's low so that the tenant can live there. But without a subsidy, the rent has to be high enough that you can also pay the condo fees and the insurance and everything else. So it just it makes it difficult without a subsidy attached. But I don't know. I think the town building cost a lot of money to renovate, but I don't know what it was off the top of my head.
Sure.
I'm going to just add that it may seem like it's easier to rehabilitate old buildings, but the code with which they were built and versus the code now is hugely different, and not always is it cheaper to rehabilitate. Sometimes it can be actually more expensive.
Sure. So sort of related, and this question was directed at you, Abhi, is, and you had mentioned it in your presentation around converting unused office space into residential housing. So if you could talk about that as far as what's happening across the state.
So this is something that actually came from the representative who sponsored that legislation, Rep. Vargas. And this is something we are seeing post-COVID, that there are many vacant spaces that can be used for affordable housing, and that is something so what that bill would do is basically make it easier to zone for these properties to be converted into residential, and we are not sure how that's going to go, but that is something we have put out there, and that is something we are hoping at least starts a conversation about these things, especially in urban centers and also in many other places, to make it easier to build housing over there. It's not, we just heard like in Braintree, I think it was in Boston Globe just the other day, that they were trying to build a development on a parking lot which was not that used of an old strip mall. And so
South Shore Plaza,
yes,
right? Yeah.
Yes, and so just making those kind of developments a little bit easier to pass is what we are trying to do through this bill.
Great, thank you. Question I have, and I'm going to ask Anna, but anyone comment is, and it's been talked about a little bit, so the legislature and Governor Baker advocated for some zoning reform changes that passed in 2020. So it was the housing choice about the threshold for certain types of increased density of housing to pass at town meeting or city council, and the transit-oriented zoning. So that passed in 2020. The past 2 years, the Baker Polito administration implemented and promulgated regulations on that. And if you could talk about your knowledge about what Littleton has done in response to that, has there been any impacts? And, some of the developments you talked about, do those fit into either of those categories?
Yes, actually, all three of the developments that I spoke about have a part in this. So a couple of years ago, as you said, when this first started out, Littleton got on board, and we have some land by the train station, and we had a group of town committee members as well as consultants working to be able to create a vision document of what it would look like down there. And so about 2 years ago, we got pretty close to sending a proposed bylaw to town meeting, and we pulled it because there were a lot of questions that still needed to be answered. And so here we are 2 years later, and what transpired in that time frame is that IBM left, and we had a developer who was looking to be able to create housing over there. And so our town planner has worked with the various state groups that need to be a part of the discussion to say, hey, if we have this lovely area down by the train station, and we're going to be required to have upwards of 700 units down there, instead of putting all 700 units down a little old country road called Foster Street, can we instead put, some of that number capacity in the town common where we're already planning to build them anyway? And so she has been able to work with folks, and we submitted what is called the MBTA Communities Action Plan to DHCD so that we could get essentially initial approval, if you will, for all of our ideas of what we want to do. And so that was submitted in early January, and it came back as approved. So the idea of being able to use what we're going to build in the common for what's going to be required of us at the train station looks like it's going to be accepted. One of the things that I think is really helpful is that before the pandemic, we had a small shuttle that was going back and forth between the IBM building and our train station. And so the developer of King Street Common has in their decision that they will, at their expense, be able to provide transportation so that whoever lives at the King Street Common area will have that transportation to go to the train station back and forth if they would like. So that's really helpful. And I think that this is a good way for the town to be able to meet its housing needs as well as comply with what the state is requiring.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much. That's great. So I mentioned the regulations on the transit-oriented zoning. Perhaps I should be able to explain them, but I'm going to ask Abhi. There were, and I think probably some people in the audience are more aware of this than others, but of course, once the legislature made these changes, which again are the first zoning changes in a generation, arguably since probably the 1970s, perhaps, there was the implementation, and there was a lot of feedback from many communities, including many suburban communities I represent, about, what would be the interpretation for the transit-oriented zoning. So if you could talk about what they are. I know it gets a little specific, but
it's pages and pages of stuff. But I think the basic idea behind that was sharing the responsibility of all the towns who are near who have a train station, who have a bus station, to make smart growth a priority, as in build near the transportation, which helps, first of all, support the T, but also it just ties up housing and transportation, get people to the jobs easier, and obviously reducing usage of cars. So what that housing choice reform did was not just make it easier for cities and towns to pass zoning bylaws by a simple majority instead of a supermajority, but also establish this MBTA communities, which is Section 3A, which basically asks communities near to the transit stations to have a district of a reasonable size where multifamily would be allowed by right, so that it would not need any variance or permitting, it would just be allowed by right. And each community has to pick a district which is in a certain radius from a transit stop or a bus station for that district to be placed over there, and should have a certain amount of density which is zoned for. It does not mean it's getting built, but basically it allows for being built of multifamily by right in that district. And the communities are required to submit their plan of how they plan to create that district of a certain acreage based on every town and their proximity to transit, to the transit station. And so that varies by every town. There is a whole lot of maps and stuff that are available through DHCD, where you can look at, like, where does your town lie, and what is it that is needed. But I think yesterday was the deadline for submitting that first plan by each community, because if the communities did not do this, they would lose critical funding like MassWorks, local capital project fund, and housing choice, which are some funds that, as we heard in many of these presentations, are used for many of these developments and infrastructure as well. So it was really the state pushing communities to sort of embrace this zoning change and allowing more housing to be built near transit. And communities can choose how they want to place it, what makes sense for them. So we are glad to see that most communities have actually come in compliance and have submitted their proposals. And Mass Housing Partnership, CHAPA, and many other organizations are, CHAPA and MHP are leading this, but they are offering a lot of technical support to the town officials, government, and even planners to sort of go through this process. And there are lots of resources available for that, but that's sort of that in a nutshell. I'm happy to share more links.
And CHAPA is a resource to communities.
Oh, yeah. So we have our municipal engagement initiative, and we have a dedicated person who has office hours where you can just go and talk to her and get any questions or anything you have regarding how to go ahead with this process, what this means, how to do it in your town, or where is your town in terms of in this process. We are happy to take those questions. We have a person dedicated for this, and there is a whole lot of technical assistance that communities are going to need, but we are one door. We are happy to connect people and communities to that assistance and resources as needed. So I'm happy to share. I have like so many resources. I'm happy to share them via email and other links.
Excellent. I know Anna had mentioned that, CHAP was helpful when doing her work on some of the zoning changes. So thank you very much. Question for Kelley, and this comes up a lot with either public housing or affordable housing projects in communities I represent around local preference. So for McManus Place, which you've talked about, but also for Tavernier Place, which is almost done, right? Mm-hmm. Is there local preference for Acton residents?
So the town had to ask DHCD. Oh, I'm sorry. Town had to ask DHCD to allow there to be local preference, and so that was granted for Tavernier Place, and they're putting the request in for us as well. So 70% of the units, I believe, at Tavernier Place are going to be local preference.
Okay,
Yeah.
excellent. And I would just note on Tavernier Place, because anyone who follows me on social media, I'm quite vigilant that when there are affordable housing opportunities, really trying to post that, because one of my frustrations is when there is something built and then people miss the deadline. Just, to show you the dynamic around Tavernier Place is that, at least 4 or 5 of my constituents applied for Tavernier Place. One person was accepted. It's 36 units. How many units is Tavernier?
Yeah, 31, I think.
31. So, and this person is someone, a senior citizen, worked all of her life taking care of children, whether in schools, childcare as a nanny, and now, she's going to be placed at Tavernier Place when it's done. So it really does make a difference, and she'll finally have housing that she can really afford versus paying 50% of her income towards, over 50% towards her rent. So thank you for explaining that on the local preference.
If I could add on
yeah.
the housing search, there is a website called Housing Navigator, which helps you find housing, even ADA compliant housing, and just makes housing search a little bit easier because many people many developers post on the website. So if you are looking for that, that's a great resource.
Great, terrific. So another question for Anna. And again, it's important to get these questions out because these are some of the things that, are commonly heard about. So how do the new units, I guess new housing units that are planned for the future in Littleton take into account schools or the increase in kids in schools from new housing?
Sure. So I think typically the questions around infrastructure come up, especially when large numbers come into play. So during the time that King Street Crossing came in for the discussion about their proposed development, we had an opportunity to previously with the bylaw that got enacted shortly before that to highlight the numbers in terms of what was going to be the impact on school enrollment, what was going to be the impact on fire, police, emergency medical services. And so those are all the important things that obviously people want to know about. So that was highlighted during the bylaw being established to identify, well, what could be done at the IBM site. And then when they came in for their decision, we continued to ask them some more questions. And then now that they are the same developer of King Street Common is also going to be the developer for the mill project. And so we have asked them to provide updated versions of that information so that we can answer questions to residents about what will be the school impact, what will be the impact with fire, EMS, and all of the other things that are really important and relevant for town residents to know. And in terms of school enrollment, the biggest thing that is a factor right now is just declining enrollment in other communities. And so being able to see those updated numbers is something that we are looking forward to.
Great, thank you so much. And I think I would really highlight, and you see it again in many communities in this area, is that where we're talking about making sure there's housing for all residents, really want to make sure that that includes low-income housing or truly affordable housing for families. Is that, I've seen, communities that are quicker to provide housing for seniors or, but not as much for multi-family housing. And, often the argument is raised, which I think is a false argument, that, well, because they're, the costs of the schools, well, that's essentially guaranteeing you're not going to have a true diversity of families in any community. So it's just something that I think sometimes is said, but I think sometimes people are not as aware of what it can mean. And I mean not just diversity in terms of income, but racial and ethnic diversity too.
Jamie.
Oh, yes.
So for the development that I was mentioning, the King Street Common one, of the 780 units, there are 468 to be one-bedroom, 234 to be two-bedroom, and 78 to be three-bedroom. So that's part of where the family component
Right.
can be helpful. Yeah.
Right, so realistically, unless it's three-bedroom, it's often not very helpful to families.
Yep.
Excellent, thank you. Oh, yeah, of course.
As far as the three-bedroom, I'm sorry.
Sometimes a three-bedroom apartment isn't big enough,
Oh, yeah.
honestly. I lost a very dear friend who had to move out of Pondside because she needed a four-bedroom. She left Acton Housing Authority and had to move to Lowell, and she hates where she is, hates it. Absolutely hates it. She wished she never left Pondside. She wished she just had stayed and just muddled through it and just dealt with it.
Absolutely.
But she needed a four-bedroom, but the apartment she went to is just awful. So, I think that might be something that needs to be revisited as far as maybe not so many one-bedrooms. Do we really need that many one-bedroom apartments in Littleton? Maybe those numbers need to be revisited, and maybe we need some four-bedroom apartments and make them more, more families. I think you're going to find that you need more family units. You really, really do. You really do.
Absolutely. And Maureen, since you were talking about, housing for people with disabilities, and thank you again for sharing your story. Question, how can someone living on a disability afford to keep their housing? And I guess I would broaden that to say not just the housing, but what other supports would you like to see in a community?
I think the biggest thing that in my area that we're lucky enough to have is that we have Loaves and Fishes. That's fabulous to us. For people who can't get out, they deliver to Pondside twice a month. They deliver your groceries to you, which is great. And they're wonderful to deal with. The churches, they're awesome. Reach out to your churches. They will help you. St. Anne's, reach out to St. Anne's in Littleton, or any of your local churches. They will help you. If you're struggling and you're on disability, reach out to, they will give you a list of this long of different people you can reach out to that will help you figure out where you can save money to, to stay afloat. It's hard, but I have learned to do it. I have learned to do it.
I know it's a challenge.
It is, but
If I can add, the independent living centers who we work with are a great resource, especially because they specifically cater to people who have disabilities, and they are the ones who inform all our policies around disability and HVP.
And I'll add a little detail on that because it just happened Friday, is the Metro West Center for Independent Living, advocating for people with disabilities. And so they just had their legislative breakfast on Friday in Framingham. They're located in Framingham. But, one of the things that they advocate for is the increase in the alternative housing voucher program, which I've been proud to be the Senate lead on that. So we've dramatically increased that. So that's providing hundreds of more vouchers that are specifically for people with disabilities to live in private housing. So that's really critical, but I still think we're not at the level we were at 20 years ago with MRVP, HVP. So those cuts haven't.
Sevens, right? Is that what they were called? Or 747?
Is that, see, I don't even, okay, 747, yep.
No, the MRVPs used to be called 747 program or something, and Finland went after it.
Yep.
Oh, sorry, I'm just talking.
So a question, perhaps for everyone, how do we meet the challenge of having affordable housing in affluent communities presents? There are no affordable, convenient places in these communities to meet shopping and daily needs. Again, I'm just reading the question. I don't know if you can talk about, and I think, Anna, you in many ways already answered it, but prioritizing where denser housing goes, and therefore it's closer to shopping or transportation, et cetera.
Exactly. Some of those conversations did take place in terms of, where does it make sense to be able to have housing so that it is convenient. We are a very automobile-centric community at this time, and so the other project that's going on in our town right now is the bicycle pedestrian committee, BPAC, is working through its own master plan to be able to identify where in town we need upgrades for bicycles and pedestrians. We have a rather tricky common area, and so again, being able to facilitate all of that along with what's going to be happening around King Street Common will be very helpful to make it safe and very usable.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. So a question online, perhaps a sort of question around what's impacting the housing market. So what, if anything, is being done about some of the more recent drivers of housing costs, like private equity buying rental units? They raise the rents and then make more by few who pay with tax breaks for the vacant housing that nobody rents out, which probably a bit of a Boston dynamic. There's a lot of perfectly good units that are vacant, enriching billionaires while we're trying to build new ones at public expense. So I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that.
I don't think there's much of a vacancy rate right now anywhere, but so one of the things that's impacting the market right now is the post-COVID economy. Just the supplies are more expensive. The interest rates are high again, so that impacts the cost. Our just construction costs for our regular projects have gone through the roof. And I know a lot of housing development has been delayed because of, and I don't really know that it's the electrical transformers that people need are so far behind production. So those are the types of things that are impacting it now. I know in, they're able to get really high rents in the private market right now. It's insane. I mean, the Avalon apartments are going for more than $3,000 for 3 bedrooms.
That's a fun, I guess.
Yeah, so it's, the market is unfortunately, there is not enough supply and the cost goes up, so.
I'm just going to add that there also have been a lot of restrictive zoning laws put into place over the last couple of decades that have led us to this point. And so that is also why where we are starting at zoning policies, that we have got to make it easier and not difficult to build more. Otherwise, we have a great economy, but not enough housing to support that economy. And that balance is going to go off, and we are close to that. So there are many factors, and we have to start working on all of them.
Absolutely. Thank you. Sort of on the other side of the housing crisis, it says Tracy Kidder's book, Rough Sleepers, talks about the housing and healthcare needs of the homeless. Are there programs west of Boston that address their special needs?
So we give a priority for housing for homeless. So we have housed both individuals and families who are coming out of shelters. And all the public housing units have. I think 48% was what I was told by DHCD based on the CHAMP information, the number of public housing units going to homeless. But there aren't a lot of shelter facilities for people when they're in an emergency situation in the western part of the SMOC has some in Framingham, there's some in Lowell, Waltham has an adult shelter. Every family has to go through the state to get shelter. They have to apply through DHCD. I used to actually run the Emergency Shelter Commission for the city of Boston for 10 years. And there wasn't enough shelter then. And the city had tons of space, but we still didn't have enough. But out here, it's really hard. When we have somebody come to our office who's really in crisis, there's not a lot of places around here. There just aren't. But housing is given, public housing gives a priority to homeless, so a lot of homeless people are served through that resource.
And I would just note, because it's something that was happening at the beginning of the Baker-Polito administration, and now is happening again, just in terms of not assigning any blame, but just the timeline, is the placing of homeless families in hotels, including in this area. So I know that I think in the past week, DHCD has placed homeless families at the Best Western in Concord by the Concord Rotary. And then talking to other colleagues throughout my district, there are now families at a hotel in Southborough, which covers Route 9. And in Westborough, which is a former state hospital, they're now constructing a shelter, I think, for immigrant families, so for migrant families that came from natural disaster, et cetera, that are going to be placed. And then in Devens, the former military base that I represent, and Representative Sina and I toured it a few weeks ago, is that a shelter just to process both sort of homeless families that have lived in Massachusetts for a while and migrant families, including from Haiti and from some Central American countries, are being processed there, and then attempt to provide shelter, housing for them after, say, a week. So we toured that facility. So this is happening, and obviously, if we don't have enough housing, that's going to continue to happen, and Governor Healy has just filed a supplemental budget that will just fund these new shelters that are popping up, or where homeless families are living in motels. So just want to note that. We're almost at 9 o'clock, so I think I'm just going to ask one more question. Can a voucher be used to keep someone in their home? So I guess to keep them from being homeless, and I guess I would broaden it to are there other assistance programs to keep people in their homes who might be facing eviction?
So we do have short-term rental assistance programs. It's called RAFT, Residential Assistance for Families in Transition, that offers I think up to $7,000 if you are about to be behind on rent or have received an eviction notice and need some help making the rent. There is that, but eventually we do want to hope to get more vouchers, so there is long-term assistance. I want to add to that.
So the voucher program can be used for people to become first-time home buyers. There are some housing authorities that have that program, but I'm pretty sure on the federal side, HUD doesn't allow you to use a voucher if you own a unit to pay the mortgage. You can buy a unit, you can become a first-time home buyer, but we're not allowed to let people even rent from a family member who owns a unit unless there's a disability-related issue. So right now, I don't think there is. You can stay in an apartment. If you're renting an apartment, you can use the voucher to stay where you are, but not if you own, I don't think.
Great, thank you so much. So Abhi Kurve, Kelley Cronin, Anna Hueston, Maureen Parlon, thank you so much for an incredible discussion. It shows the nuance that's going to hand. So really appreciate you coming to speak at this forum. I want to thank the Acton, Boxborough, Littleton, and Maynard Democratic Town Committees. Thank our wonderful volunteers, Sam Fieldman, Stella Coe, Sahana Purwitt, Leela Ramachandran, Ellen Valad, for taking the questions. And I just want to announce, hopefully folks get a sense that Democratic committees, the idea is to have more policy forums working with committees. And so the next forum that the Maynard Democratic Town Committee is leading, Kimberly Connors, is on childcare, and it's on March 16th at 7 p.m. at the Maynard Library. So we hope to see you there. Thank you so much for coming, and looking forward to the continuing